Good morning. If you would, please join me in prayer. Lord, as we see Jesus as an innocent man this morning being accused of horrific things at one point and very accurate things at another, Father, I pray that you would help us to embrace the idea that his seating on the throne makes him the judge over our lives. And Father, I pray that we would embrace this so fully that we ultimately are transformed by it. And it's in your Son's name I pray. Amen. If you will, turn with me to Mark chapter 14. Pick up just where we left off. This is Mark chapter 14. We'll begin reading in verse 53. Mark 14, 53. As you find that passage, would you stand together as we read out of reverence for God's word? Mark 14, 53. And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guard and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priest and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus, to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands." Yet even about this their testimony did not agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But he remained silent and made no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." And the guards received him with blows. Please be seated. This morning, there is a strong sense of irony being played out in this passage. It's this ironic reversal that is being played out right before our eyes in Jesus' life, and in particular, his words. Irony sometimes, though, gets lost on us, not because we don't understand irony, but because of the subtlety that it is employed by Mark. So when I say ironic reversal, just to get us all on the same page, it is like someone who is walking down the street and they step into a pothole not realizing it's there, and it's ankle deep with water. They shake their leg off, and the person walking behind them chuckles and said, "I can't believe you did that." And they step around the pothole right into an oncoming bus. Right? So that's kind of the irony, is that you really missed the bigger issue. And that's what's going on in this passage. This idea of irony, though, takes on aspects that are subtle but impactful, because it really changes the dynamic of our life once we see it. Have you seen the movie Maleficent? Came out a few years ago. It was the real-life action remake of Sleeping Beauty. And as the movie played out, the main character was this evil witch. And so if you're familiar with Sleeping Beauty was threatened by an evil witch, so she was raised by her fairy godmothers in the forest. Well, the real-life action one puts an ironic twist of reversal in there, in that the wicked witch is not the one who is at fault in Sleeping Beauty's life. Her bumbling idiot stepmothers, godmothers, were the ones who were really causing her harm, and it was Maleficent, the evil witch, all along, who was out protecting her. And she should have just seen it the right way. It's kind of the premise of the movie. And if you haven't watched the movie, I just ruined it. And so, that idea, though, really is a huge factor in our lives. There are some people who were raised in a home, and they would describe their parent, maybe their father. It's a daughter. She says, my father was always overbearing, high expectations, and verbally abusive. I disdain that man to this very day. But you know what that same lady spent her entire adult life doing? Trying to live up to those high expectations to prove him wrong. The irony of her life is that what she disdained, really she has grown to embrace. It's this reversal that should take place, but it didn't. This happens in other ways with great parents. So teenagers, hear me out for just a moment. You will hit your 20s and you will have spent a decade bucking every rule your parents have set forward, only to realize all of those rules were legitimate and if they had been followed would be helpful. Right? It's going to happen to you. I know you don't believe me. And you think, what does that guy know? He's not a teenager. Just trust me on this one. So, that idea, though, that we've lived one way with kind of perceived reality, when in fact it was reversed, completely the opposite. And the irony of life is one day it will be disclosed, is transpiring in this passage. It is transpiring in this passage in the same way that it transpires in our lives. Here's what I find ironic in the Christian life. The closer we get to God, develop in many of us a fear that God is judging us. That He sits on the throne in judgment over us. To the point that many of us operate by that idea, that we're being judged by God. And the ironic thing is, the closer we get in a relationship to Him, many times, the more we feel the weight of that. And so we live in this perpetual fear of the judgment of God. When in all actuality, what should happen, what should transpire, is the more you realize God is on the throne of judgment, it is actually freeing and liberating. It is freeing, not confining. It's liberating, not oppressive. But it's not until we see it. If we don't see it, we'll make the same mistake this high priest. He goes unnamed. His name is Caiaphas. The high priest is making the same mistake of misunderstanding who is actually sitting in judgment. So I want us not to follow in his footsteps, to rightly perceive it, and what we will find out is this ironic twist that God sitting in judgment is for my benefit, not my curse. So let's work through it together. There's 3 significant reversals I wanted to point out to you. 3 significant. The first 2 we will be rather brief with. The third one is a little bit quicker. So here they are, just so we can follow along more easily. The first one is Jesus is actually innocent. We'll come back to each one. Secondly, Jesus is divine or God. But thirdly, and most significantly, Jesus is the judge. So Jesus is innocent, Jesus is God, and Jesus is the judge. So let's take up our first one. Jesus is innocent. Here's the ironic reversal in this section. It is impossible to condemn Jesus. It is impossible to discredit or condemn Jesus. So they set out from the start to do exactly that. Let me show it to you in the passage. Mark is writing, and he kind of interrupts his story, as I'm sure you noted. And he talked about Peter being in the courtyard. Then he took us in the chief priest's house, and as we are in there, he leads us through this idea that he says in verse 56, For many bore false witness against Jesus. Well, he just said they found none who could legitimately testify. So they went through a series of witnesses, and all bore false witness. So you can imagine, put yourself in a courtroom in modern day. It wouldn't be a stretch. We see one on CNN or Fox News, whoever you watch. Over the past week, some of Trump's previous counsels been in a courtroom, in and out. So we're very familiar with it. Or maybe let me relate a little bit differently. Matlock, Law and Order, The Practice. So just whatever your vision is, right? We get the courtroom. Hopefully it's not you later this week or something, but we get the idea. You're in the courtroom, and one of the things we have seen play out over and over and over again in our lifetime is character assassination. Right? They're going to bring in witnesses that really don't have that much to do with testifying about the crime. They have everything to do with bringing you down a few notches. So that's where they start. Character assassination on Jesus. They're going to bring him down, discredit him. But Mark tells us these witnesses were conflicting. Why is that so big? Well, here's why. Our day and age, if you were going to have foolproof testimony, we would base it on DNA evidence, right? They found his DNA on the murder weapon and at the scene. What do we all say? We've watched enough NCIS. He's guilty. Between Matlock and NCIS, you are a lawyer. And so we've watched enough of that to know he's guilty. Their day and age, the golden rule was not DNA. The golden rule was 2 or 3 witnesses in agreement. That was the golden rule under Old Testament law. You get 2 or 3 witnesses in agreement, then you pronounce guilt. So they're failing to get that. So they finally come to the spot where they have a couple witnesses who agree. Their agreement is he promised to destroy the temple. But Mark points out that even though they're talking about the same subject, when they come and testify, they still don't agree. So there's this attempt to discredit Jesus. There's an attempt to prove that he is guilty, and that every step along the way it falls short. Here's why. It's not because they couldn't build a good case. It's because Jesus is innocent. Not just here, period. Let me say it differently, more Bible-y sounding language. Jesus is righteous. He is perfectly righteous. So there is no sin or wrongdoing in his being. So when we say he's innocent, that's what we mean. Perfectly righteous. Secondarily, Jesus is the truth. There is no deception, no lying, no misleading. He is purely truth. Who he is who he is, and it is always righteous. So any attempt to discredit that person will inevitably always fall short. Hear me well. In Jesus' day or in your day, any attempt by any group will say more about the person trying to discredit Jesus than it will ever say about Jesus. Every time, always. You will either be lying about Jesus and false witness in that sense, or you will be trying to discredit Jesus based on your own false sense of values and false morality. My back on? No? I don't know what to do. Is my microphone working? No. All right. Sorry, forgive me. This is not for dramatic effect. This is 8. All right. Oh, there we are. Okay. That thing was hurting my ear anyways. So Jesus is always the truth. He is always righteous. Any attempt to discredit him by Time magazine just before this Easter or witnesses in Jesus' day are either lying or they have a false set of values they're trying to judge Jesus on. Because he is perfectly righteous and he is the truth. However, in that state of being completely innocent, purely innocent, he does not rebut any of the charges. As Justin helpfully read this morning from Isaiah 53, this was to fulfill prophecy. It says, "We all like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him, Jesus, the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth." Because what he is doing is he is taking on your sin. If he opens his mouth and says, "I'm innocent," which would have been true, and had avoided the charges, he could not have stepped in your guilty place. He doesn't open his mouth, he doesn't defend himself because he's intentionally choosing to take on the sin of our lives. By doing so, his innocence comes to all those who would trust him. Our guilt is put on his shoulders. So Jesus is truly innocent. They're setting out to do the impossible. Secondly, Jesus is divine, or Jesus is God. Here's the ironic reversal. Charges that they are levying against him are more incriminating than they could have imagined. Right? They think, we got him. Oh, you got him, and you got more than you bargained for. Let me show you what I mean. This would be a slam dunk case. You know, in all those TV shows, those law TV shows, the lawyer waits till just the right moment with that one piece of evidence nobody expected, and it causes the witness on the witness stand to confess to the crime. Well, that's this moment. Jesus on trial for his life. And they've gone through all of these witnesses. Caiaphas, the high priest, is held back. And you see that he steps forward. It says he put himself in the midst of all the people. So he would have been sitting down. They would have sat and had Jesus stand. He would have been sitting down waiting for that moment. They've gone through everything else and he steps forward. Because all of the other witnesses, they know there's some discrepancies. They know really what they need to pin Jesus on is his own testimony. So he steps forward and he asks him this question, as we read this morning. The high priest stood in the midst and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" So let me pause for just a moment. We read that with Christian ears. Take your Christian ears off for just a moment. Let's go back and read it as if you were a Jew 2,000 years ago. So when he says, "Are you the Christ?" we think Christ, Jesus, God, we put all of that on him. When he says Christ, he means Messiah. Are you the one who's going to come deliver Israel? In particular, deliver Israel from Rome. Because here's their goal. Their goal, where they are, the conversation they're having, is not a formal court appearance. The formal court appearance will come before Pilate. what they have to do is they have to establish charges at this moment. Their goal is to say, if he claims to be the Messiah, one of the things the Messiah is going to do is overthrow Rome. He would be anti-Rome. That's their goal, is for him to confess, yes, I am the Messiah. That doesn't mean he's God. That just means he's going to be this political leader. Justin Martyr said the Jewish expectation of the day, writing about 100 years after Jesus. He says that the Messiah would simply be a man among men. So they didn't think he was God, and Caiaphas is not asking him, are you God? He's saying, are you going to be the deliverer? And that is the charge. Ultimately, they get Jesus on. John 19:12 says, when they are before Pilate, you have to kill Jesus. If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So saying he's a king, he is going to deliver Israel and oppose Caesar. That's what Caiaphas is after when he says, are you the Christ? And then he says, the Son of the Blessed. He's tacking this on. Son of the Blessed. Let's take it just word at a time for just a second. Blessed simply means God. It's a circumlocution. It's a way of referencing God without actually saying his name. Your Bible does it to this day. If you flip through the Old Testament, you'll notice sometimes the word Lord is in all caps. When it's in all caps, it's circumlocution for Yahweh. In the Hebrew, originally they wrote Yahweh, but out of respect, they would not use the divine name. So they would say Jehovah or Lord or blessed. So what he says is, are you the one who's going to deliver Israel because you believe you are blessed by God? That's what he wants to get Jesus on. So he stands up in dramatic fashion in the courtroom, really in his home. Jesus responds more profoundly than Caiaphas would have guessed. First, he says, I am. Many I am statements. God says, when Moses says, how am I going to tell the people that God has sent me? He says, say, I am has sent you, my eternal, always existing being. Jesus uses that ego eimi language to begin. I am the Messiah. I am the deliverer of Israel. I am favored by God, but it's worse than you think, Caiaphas. He says, I am the Son of Man who is coming and will be seated at the right hand of power. Those two ideas, Son of Man and seated at the right hand of power, are throwback to things Mark has already discussed, and a throwback to Daniel 7:13 and 14 and Psalm 110 verse 1. In those Old Testament passages, in Daniel, it is the Son of Man has an everlasting eternal kingdom. No human can have an everlasting eternal kingdom. It is a direct claim to be God. Psalm 110 verse 1 says it is David speaking. The Lord said to my Lord, who is seated at his right hand. Jesus is claiming to be the Lord seated at Yahweh's right hand. So here's what Caiaphas asks. Caiaphas says, are you the one, this man, who's going to come deliver the nation of Israel? Jesus answered, I am that, and I am God standing before you. To which Caiaphas is furious, tearing his clothes. And he says, we don't need any more testimony. His testimony of himself is enough to execute him. He has just claimed to be God. But Jesus did not just claim to be God. He claimed more than that. Because these specific references to Daniel and Psalms point to something else. not just that he's God, but specific attributes of God. That God will sit on the throne in judgment at the end of the age, and particularly brought out in Daniel. Let me make this case a little more. Matthew gives us a parallel reading in Matthew chapter 25. Matthew 25:31. Jesus talking about the same idea, the Son of Man coming at the end of the age. 25:31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He is going to come at the end, the Son of Man, sit on his glorious throne. He doesn't need to consult what works you've done in this life to determine whether or not you're a sheep or a goat. He already knows in Matthew's account. He will come to sit on the throne. What Jesus answers is, Caiaphas, you're judging me, but really I am the ultimate judge. Caiaphas, you think you're going to condemn me by condemning Jesus. Caiaphas is actually condemning himself. By trying to make Jesus pay the ultimate penalty in this life, he is actually setting himself up to pay the ultimate penalty forever. There's this ironic reversal playing out in this very situation. This ironic reversal does result in Caiaphas and others condemning Jesus and condemning themselves, misunderstanding that they are before a judge. But here's where I want us to pause for just a moment. Here's where I think we make the same mistake, and then we'll come back to the story. If we misunderstand Jesus as being the judge over our lives, if we make that Caiaphas mistake, it really sets us up to relate to God in a way that is false or faulty in our own lives. So we can't make that mistake. We have to rightly understand what Jesus said at this point when he says, I am the judge. So let me maybe put it in real practical terms, how we might make this mistake. Paul is very helpful at this point. So if you have a Bible, I would encourage you. Turn to 2 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 4. I would go so far as to say these would be helpful verses to memorize. It says 1 Corinthians chapter 4. What Paul does is he says, okay, I don't want to make the mistake of Caiaphas thinking that Jesus is not the judge, that somebody else is the ultimate judge I should be concerned with. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3, he says, but with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. For I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. You see what he's done? Caiaphas thought Caiaphas was the judge. At times, we might think we're the judge, or somebody else is the judge. Paul has gotten it exactly right. He says, I don't have to worry about any of those others being a judge. It is the Lord who judges me. But let's walk through, real quickly, how he describes each group and who might judge whom. He's saying, first, don't allow other people's judgment to impact your life. That would be to take Jesus off the position of being judge and to put them up. Have you ever been guilty of that? Feeling as though someone else and their pronouncement about your value and worth, their pronouncement about your successes or failures. Just like I mentioned at the beginning, that daughter who lives for the approval of her father in an inappropriate way has taken Jesus off the judgment seat and put her hateful father on it. We can easily succumb to that. Secondly, he's implying you should not put yourself in the judgment seat of the Lord over someone else. If they shouldn't judge you, they should point you to the Lord as judge, nor should you, in turn, judge them. So every occasion of racism, every occasion of sexism, is someone saying, I make judgments myself. Jesus is not the judge here. I am. I determine your value and worth based upon my own standards. Let me be very careful at this point. Many people abuse this idea of don't judge me. What Paul does is he is pointing the Corinthians. He's saying, I am not going to be your judge, but I am pointing you to the actual judge. Let me show you why I would say that. Because some of you are familiar with 1 Corinthians, and you would flip over to the next chapter. Chapter 5, verse 12. For what have I to do with judging, for what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? But God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. You say, well, here he's already, you can't say don't judge people, because here he tells us to judge people in the church. Well, I think it's helpful to take those two passages together. In this sense, the Bible consistently tells us the way we judge in the church is when you are in violation of Jesus, I warn you. And I should make that warning very clear. When there is sin in your life, it is appropriate to acknowledge, say, I believe you are wrong before God. But He's going to make that judgment. And I never judge somebody by my own standard. I point them to the actual judge. And we have an obligation to do that warning in the church with other believers. But we never point outside. But everything I've said thus far, I think you would already have familiarity with. That Paul, back in chapter 4, is saying, I've learned the lesson from Caiaphas. I should not let other people judge me, and I shouldn't judge them. But let me show you the thing that I don't want us to miss. And I think this is really profound. This is the most freeing part. He says, don't put yourself on the throne of judgment. So Mitch, you already said that. Here's what I mean. If you go back to chapter 4, in verse 3, he said, at the end of the verse, the last sentence, in fact, I do not even judge myself. I do not even judge myself. I don't know how many times in life I've gotten bogged down by judging myself. Saying things to myself I knew I wouldn't measure up. I should have recognized I wasn't capable of doing that. I'm not smart enough. I'm not pretty enough. I knew I couldn't handle these things. I always mess things up. I know I'm not really useful anymore. I'm such an idiot. Don't you know you're never going to be more than fill in the blank? You're never going to be more than an alcoholic. You're never going to be more than somebody who scrapes by. You're never going to be more. You see what you've done? See what I've done? I've taken Jesus off of the judgment seat and I've put myself there over my own life. Paul is saying, stop it. Those are illegitimate judgments. You're making the same mistake as Caiaphas. What you must do is realize, as Paul did, the Lord is the one on the judgment seat. And the judgment he is rendering is what Jesus was demonstrating. The judgment he will render for all those who trust in him is you are found innocent because Jesus didn't open his mouth. He stepped in your place to consume the guilt and the sin and wipe it away. Any judgment short of that is a false one for every believer. I think when we pause and we say, I no longer judge even myself, it's transformative. That would be a wrong assessment. It is the Lord alone who judges me. And it is that same Lord, judge, who stood in my place and took the sin and the punishment that characterized my life. It is the Lord who judges me. So I take myself off of that judgment seat. The reminder that I should take myself off of that judgment seat is the cross. The reminder that he has done something I'm incapable of is found in the Lord's Supper. The reminder that I am going to be judged and found innocent in the same degree that Jesus is evidenced by the spilling of his blood and the breaking of his body. This participation in the Lord's Supper this morning is a reminder that 1 Corinthians 4:3 applies to you. He is the judge over me. I don't even judge myself. So I think it's a phenomenal opportunity for us to celebrate what Christ has done on our behalf. Here's my encouragement, though, for you. Anyone who is a baptized believer, we would love for you to participate in this ceremony of the Lord's Supper with us. However, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 gives us rather stark warnings in terms of the Lord's Supper, specifically this. He says, some of you have been eating and drinking the Lord's Supper wrongly. Should you not first examine your own life and then partake in the Lord's Supper? Because without doing so, some of them have been eating and drinking sickness and death upon themselves. Very few other places in Scripture give that stark a warning for some activity you might participate in. So I think it goes without saying that first what we will do is examine our own lives for just a moment. Just an opportunity of prayer to say, God, before you, I want to be in right standing. Now, we don't make ourselves be in right standing. It's because of Christ. But I do believe that if there is something where I say, I know that there's an issue between me and God. I know in my heart that really there is something that has gone unresolved, unrepented of. Then we either, during this time of prayer, work through those things, or I believe we abstain from the Lord's Supper, which is not uncommon. You just let it pass by. You pass the juice and the bread by. But I think there is a seriousness and a weight to this occasion that we should be respectful of. So to that end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin in prayer. Then I'm going to allow for a moment of silence, and I would ask you just to pray. just between you and God, to be in right position before we participate in the Lord's Supper. And so I will then close us in prayer and we will partake. So let's begin with prayer. Father, we are grateful for the fact that you saw fit to provide your Son, who is innocent and perfect, that you would provide him to step in my place, into every believer in this room, into their place. So Lord, I ask this morning that as we remember his sacrifice, that we would be won over once again. But Father, I also know that there are some around the room that have heard my encouragement and warning from 1 Corinthians. And so, Father, I do pray that you would allow us to have a moment of honesty and open transparentness before you over the next few moments as we pray. And Lord, lead us through that time by your Spirit. So would you please pray with me?